The autumn rain pelted against the tall windows of palace as Prince Alexander stood in his private study, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The morning newspapers lay scattered across his mahogany desk, each headline more damaging than the last. His wife, Princess, sat silently in the velvet armchair by the fireplace, her usually radiant face pale with exhaustion. Duchess caught in secret meeting with foreign ambassador, screamed the front page of the Royal Tribune. Another tabloid had gone even further. Palace insider claims princess has been selling state secrets. The photographs, though grainy and taken from a distance, clearly showed entering a private club in the capital city's diplomatic quarter, where she had met with ambassador from the neighboring kingdom of. Alexander picked up one of the papers and read aloud, his voice shaking with barely controlled anger. Sources close to the palace suggest that Princess has been meeting regularly with the representative, raising questions about her loyalty to the crown and her husband. He threw the paper down in disgust. How dare they question your loyalty? How dare they suggest you would betray our kingdom? Looked up at her husband, her blue eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. Alexander, you know why I met with him. The humanitarian crisis in the border villages requires immediate attention. Our own government has been too slow to respond, and people are dying. Ambassador offered medical supplies and temporary shelter for the refugees. I know that, Alexander said, his voice softening as he moved to kneel beside her chair. And I know your heart. You've always put the welfare of our people above everything else, including your own safety. But the way this has been twisted, the way they're making you look like a traitor. His jaw tightened again. Someone leaked this information deliberately. Someone wanted to destroy your reputation. The princess had dedicated the last 5 years of her life to charitable work throughout the kingdom. She had personally visited every major hospital, school, and orphanage in the realm. When the flooding hit the eastern provinces last spring, she had insisted on traveling there herself, despite security concerns, to oversee the relief efforts. The people loved her for her genuine compassion and her willingness to get her hands dirty for their sake. But the royal court was a different matter entirely, had never quite fit into the rigid protocols and ancient traditions that governed palace life. She spoke too freely at state dinners, questioned outdated policies too openly, and worst of all, she had the audacity to suggest that the monarchy should be more transparent with the public. These views had made her numerous enemies among the traditional courtiers and conservative members of parliament. Lord Chancellor had been particularly vocal in his disapproval of the princess. During the last royal council meeting, he had suggested that modern ideas were dangerous to the stability of the monarchy. The princess seems to forget, he had said with thinly veiled contempt, that some traditions exist because they work. Change for the sake of change is the enemy of order. Alexander's younger brother, Prince Edmund, had also grown increasingly critical of influence on palace affairs. Edmund had always been the more traditional of the two brothers, and he made no secret of his belief that was too progressive for her position. The monarchy isn't a democracy, Alexander, he had warned just last month, and needs to remember her place. Now, as Alexander read through the poisonous articles, he could see Edmund's hand in some of the quotes. An unnamed, senior royal source had told reporters that certain members of the royal family have long been concerned about the princess's judgment and her apparent disregard for proper protocol. Only Edmund would dare to speak about in such terms, even if he lacked the courage to put his name to the accusations. The door to the study opened suddenly, and Sir Thomas Blackwood, the palace's head of security, entered without his usual formal announcement. His face was grim, and he carried a thick folder under his arm. Your Highness, forgive the intrusion, but we have a serious problem. The situation is escalating rapidly. Alexander stood, his protective instincts flaring. What do you mean escalating? Sir Thomas opened the folder and spread several photographs across the desk. They showed crowds of protesters gathering outside the palace gates, some carrying signs reading, "Traitor Princess," and "Protect our kingdom from foreign influence." The crowds had grown larger throughout the morning, and several members of parliament had already called for an emergency session to discuss what they termed a potential threat to national security. The Prime Minister's office has been fielding calls all morning, Sir Thomas continued. 3 opposition leaders have demanded a formal investigation into the princess's activities. They're claiming she may have violated the Official Secrets Act by discussing state matters with a foreign representative without proper authorization. Stood up abruptly, her composure finally cracking. This is insane. I discussed refugee assistance and humanitarian aid. I didn't share military secrets or government intelligence. Every conversation I had with Ambassador was about saving lives, nothing more. But Alexander could see the bigger picture forming. This wasn't just about one meeting or even about charitable work. This was a coordinated attack designed to undermine both his wife and his own authority as heir to the throne. Someone wanted to drive a wedge between the royal family and the public, and they were willing to destroy his reputation to do it. The phone on Alexander's desk rang sharply, interrupting his thoughts. He answered it tersely. Yes. It was his father, King William, calling from his private chambers. The king's voice was cold and formal, lacking any of the warmth that usually characterized his conversations with his eldest son. Alexander, I need to see you and in my study immediately. We need to discuss this situation before it spirals completely out of control. As they walked through the palace corridors toward the king's chambers, Alexander felt a growing sense of dread. The portraits of his ancestors seemed to stare down at him accusingly, as if they too questioned his wife's loyalty. But what troubled him most was the realization that this attack was really an attack on everything they had tried to build together. For the past 5 years, Alexander had worked tirelessly to modernize the monarchy's approach to public service. They had made the royal family more accessible, more transparent, and more directly involved in addressing the kingdom's social problems. They had broken down barriers that had existed for centuries, and in doing so, they had threatened the power and influence of those who benefited from the old ways. Now those same people were striking back, using compassion and dedication against her. They had turned her greatest strength into an apparent weakness, her love for the people into evidence of disloyalty to the crown. And Alexander knew that if they succeeded in destroying, they would effectively destroy his vision for the future of the monarchy as well. As they approached the king's study, reached for Alexander's hand. Her touch was steady despite everything that had happened, and when he looked into her eyes, he saw not fear or defeat, but determination. "Whatever happens in there," she whispered, "remember that we did the right thing. The people in those border villages are alive because of the aid we helped arrange. That matters more than any headline or political game." Alexander squeezed her hand tightly, feeling his own resolve strengthen. He had spent his entire life preparing to be king, learning the delicate balance between tradition and progress, between public duty and personal conviction. But now he realized that all of that preparation had been leading to this moment, when he would have to choose between protecting his wife and preserving the peace within his own family and government. The massive oak doors to the king's study loomed before them, and Alexander could hear voices inside, heated and urgent. His father was not alone. As they paused outside the door, Alexander made a silent promise to himself and to whatever political games were being played, whatever forces were arrayed against them, he would not allow his wife to be sacrificed for the sake of appearances or tradition. He knocked firmly on the door, and when his father's voice called for them to enter, Alexander straightened his shoulders and prepared for the battle that would determine not just its future, but the future of the monarchy itself. The king's study felt like a courtroom as Alexander entered. King William sat behind his imposing desk, his weathered face stern and unreadable. But what made Alexander's blood run cold was the presence of the others in the room. Lord Chancellor stood near the tall windows, his thin frame rigid with barely concealed satisfaction. Prime Minister sat in one of the leather chairs, nervously adjusting his glasses. Most shocking of all was Prince Edmund, Alexander's own brother, who stood near the fireplace with his arms crossed, avoiding eye contact. "Sit down," King William commanded, gesturing to the 2 chairs that had been placed directly across from his desk, positioned almost like defendants' seats. The formal tone in his father's voice was one Alexander had heard used with foreign diplomats and government officials, never with family. Maintained her composure as she sat, but Alexander could feel the tension radiating from her. He remained standing for a moment, his eyes moving from his father to his brother to the Chancellor, reading the room's dynamics with growing alarm. "Father, before anyone says anything else, I want to make one thing perfectly clear," Alexander began, his voice carrying the authority of his future crown. "Princess acted with complete integrity and in the best interests of our people. Any suggestion otherwise is not just wrong, but insulting to everything she has sacrificed for this kingdom." Lord Chancellor stepped forward, his voice dripping with false concern. Your Highness, I'm afraid the situation is far more serious than personal opinions about the princess's character. We have received intelligence that suggests her meetings with the ambassador may have compromised sensitive information about our border defenses. Shot to her feet, her diplomatic training forgotten in the face of such an outrageous accusation. That is an absolute lie. I discussed refugee camps, medical supplies, and temporary housing. I never mentioned anything about military matters because I don't have access to that information, nor would I ever seek it for such purposes. Please sit down, King William said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. The accusation has been made, and it must be addressed formally. The Prime Minister has informed me that Parliament is demanding a full investigation. Prime Minister cleared his throat nervously. Your Majesty, the opposition has called for an emergency session tomorrow morning. They have enough support to force a vote of no confidence in the government's ability to maintain national security if we don't take immediate action. Alexander felt something snap inside him. The careful control he had maintained throughout his royal training, the diplomatic restraint that had been drilled into him since childhood, suddenly crumbled. Immediate action against my wife, based on lies and political manipulation. Alexander, control yourself, Edmund finally spoke, his voice cold and superior. This isn't about personal feelings, it's about the stability of the crown and the security of the realm. This reckless behavior has put us all in an impossible position. The word reckless hung in the air like a slap. Alexander turned to face his brother fully, and for the first time in their lives, Edmund actually took a step back from the fury blazing in the heir's eyes. Reckless, Alexander repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. You call it reckless to prevent children from dying of disease in refugee camps. You call it reckless to coordinate humanitarian aid with international partners. What would you call it, Edmund, when members of our own family conspire to destroy the reputation of someone who has dedicated her life to serving our people? I have done no such thing, Edmund protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Alexander pulled out his phone and scrolled through his messages until he found what he was looking for. Really? Then perhaps you can explain this text message you sent to journalist Hastings 3 days ago. He read aloud. You might want to look into recent diplomatic activities, some very interesting meetings that raise questions about her priorities and loyalties. The room fell completely silent. Edmund's face went pale, and even Lord Chancellor looked uncomfortable. King William's expression darkened as he stared at his younger son. You contacted the press? The king asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Looked at Edmund with a mixture of hurt and disbelief. You did this. You fed them the story that's destroyed my reputation and put our entire family under attack. Edmund's composure finally cracked. She needed to be stopped. You're undermining everything our family has built over centuries. You question our traditions, you ignore protocol, you act like the monarchy is some sort of social service organization instead of understanding that we represent stability and continuity. Alexander stepped forward, and this time Edmund couldn't retreat because his back was already against the fireplace mantel. So you decided to publicly humiliate her. You decided to make her look like a traitor to her own country. I thought a little negative press might make her more cautious, more aware of how her actions affect the rest of us, Edmund said desperately. I never intended for it to go this far. I didn't know they would twist everything so completely. You didn't know? His voice was incredulous. Edmund, you've lived in this palace your entire life. You know exactly how the press operates. You knew they would take any hint of scandal and turn it into a feeding frenzy. Lord Chancellor, sensing an opportunity to shift blame away from himself and the other conspirators, stepped forward with renewed confidence. Regardless of how this information became public, the fact remains that the princess's actions have created a genuine crisis. The opposition parties are calling for her to be stripped of her royal titles and removed from all official duties. That was the final straw. Alexander whirled around to face, and the Chancellor actually stumbled backward from the intensity of the prince's rage. Get out, Alexander said, his voice deadly calm. Your Highness, I don't think you understand the severity. Get out, Alexander roared, his voice echoing off the study's paneled walls. Get out before I forget that I'm supposed to be a gentleman and throw you out myself. King William raised a hand. Alexander, that's enough. Lord Chancellor, perhaps it would be best if you returned to your office for now. The Prime Minister and I can continue this discussion with my family privately. As gathered his papers and left the room with what little dignity he could maintain, Alexander turned back to his father. This ends now, father. I don't care what political games are being played or who needs to be appeased. I will not stand by and watch my wife be destroyed by lies and jealousy. And what exactly do you propose to do? King William asked, studying his eldest son carefully. The damage has been done. The press, parliament, and half the country now questions loyalty. How do you suggest we repair that? Alexander moved to stand behind's chair, placing his hands on her shoulders in a gesture of protection and solidarity. We tell the truth, all of it. We release every record of humanitarian work, every document related to the refugee assistance program, every communication with ambassador. We show the people exactly what kind of person she really is. Prime Minister shook his head vigorously. Your Highness, that would be unprecedented. The royal family doesn't typically respond to press criticism with detailed public disclosures. Then maybe it's time for some precedents to change, Alexander shot back. Maybe it's time for transparency to matter more than tradition. Edmund, who had been silent since his humiliation, finally spoke again. Alexander, you're talking about fundamentally changing how the monarchy operates. You're talking about abandoning centuries of protocol because your wife got bad press coverage. Alexander's eyes blazed as he looked at his brother. I'm talking about defending the woman I love against a coordinated attack orchestrated by cowards and hypocrites. I'm talking about showing our people that their future king won't sacrifice innocent people for political convenience. King William stood slowly, his age and the weight of his crown suddenly visible in his movements. Alexander, I understand your anger. I even admire your loyalty to your wife. But you need to consider the bigger picture. If we handle this wrong, we could damage the monarchy itself. The monarchy is already damaged, father, Alexander replied, his voice softening but remaining firm. It's damaged when members of our own family betray each other for political gain. It's damaged when we allow lies to go unchallenged because telling the truth might be inconvenient. And it's most damaged when we sacrifice good people to protect bad systems. Reached up and covered one of Alexander's hands with her own, drawing strength from his support while also trying to calm his fury. Your Majesty, she said, addressing the king directly, I understand the difficult position this has put the family in. If my stepping back from public duties would help resolve the immediate crisis, I'm willing to consider it. But I won't apologize for trying to save lives, and I won't admit to crimes I didn't commit. The offer hung in the air, and for a moment, Alexander thought his father might accept it as a reasonable compromise. But then he saw the look of calculation in the king's eyes, the way he glanced at Prime Minister, and Alexander realized that even his father was prepared to sacrifice to preserve the status. That might be the course of action, King William said slowly. A temporary withdrawal from official duties while the investigation runs its course. Alexander felt something break inside him, something fundamental about his relationship with his father and his faith in the institution he was supposed to inherit. No, he said quietly. Excuse me, the king asked. I said no, Alexander repeated, louder this time. Will not be stepping back from anything. She will not be admitting fault for actions that saved lives, and she will not be thrown to the wolves to protect people who don't deserve protection. The room erupted in voices, all talking at once, but Alexander heard none of them. He was looking at his wife, seeing the love and gratitude in her eyes, and making a decision that would change the course of the monarchy forever. The silence that followed Alexander's declaration was deafening. King William's face had gone completely white, and Prime Minister looked as though he might faint. Edmund stared at his brother in shock, while squeezed Alexander's hand, both proud of his defense and terrified of what it might cost them. Alexander, King William said slowly, his voice carrying a warning that had never been directed at his heir before. You need to think very carefully about what you're saying. The crown cannot survive if it appears weak or divided. Alexander straightened to his full height, and in that moment, everyone in the room could see the king he would one day become. The crown will survive, father, but it will survive because it stands for justice and truth, not because it sacrifices innocent people to maintain appearances. You're being naive, Edmund interjected desperately. This isn't about justice or truth. This is about politics and public perception. can weather this storm if she handles it correctly, but if you turn this into a constitutional crisis. I'm not turning this into anything, Alexander cut him off. You already did that when you decided to betray your own family for political gain. Prime Minister stood up abruptly, his face flushed with panic. Your Highness, if you publicly defy the king's judgment on this matter, it will create exactly the kind of constitutional crisis that could bring down the government. Parliament is already questioning whether the monarchy can be trusted to put national interests above personal ones. Alexander turned to face the Prime Minister fully, his voice dropping to a tone that made everyone in the room step back. Then, perhaps Parliament needs to understand that personal honor and national interest are not mutually exclusive. Perhaps they need to learn that a monarchy that cannot protect its own people from lies and political manipulation is not worthy of the public's trust. Alexander, stop, King William commanded, his voice sharp with authority. You are my heir, but you are not yet king. You will not threaten the stability of this government or this country because you're angry about newspaper headlines. Newspaper headlines? Alexander's voice rose incredulously. Is that what you think this is about? Father, they're calling my wife a traitor. They're suggesting she sold state secrets to foreign powers. They're demanding that she be stripped of her titles and exiled from public life. And you want to treat this as a public relations problem. Stood up beside her husband, her own composure finally reaching its limit. Your Majesty, with respect, I think Alexander is right. This isn't just about managing headlines anymore. The lies being spread about me are so outrageous that simply staying quiet will be seen as an admission of guilt. Then what exactly are you proposing? The king asked, his frustration evident. Alexander and exchanged a look, and in that moment they both knew they were about to cross a line from which there would be no return. We're proposing full transparency, Alexander said firmly. We release every document, every communication, every piece of evidence that shows what was really doing. We invite the press and Parliament to examine every detail of her humanitarian work. And we demand that those who spread these lies be held accountable, added, her voice steady despite the enormity of what they were proposing. Starting with the people in this room who chose political convenience over family loyalty. Edmund's face went red with anger and embarrassment. You can't seriously be thinking about exposing internal family discussions to the public. The damage to the monarchy would be irreparable. The damage has already been done, Alexander replied coldly. By people who thought they could manipulate the press and the public without consequences. By people who thought family meant so little that they could destroy one of us for political gain. King William slammed his hand down on the desk, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. Enough! I will not have this family torn apart by accusations and counter-accusations. Alexander, you will return to your quarters and think carefully about your responsibilities as heir to the throne. You will prepare a statement accepting temporary withdrawal from public duties pending the completion of the investigation. Alexander felt the full weight of royal command in his father's voice, the same tone that had made prime ministers resign and caused international incidents. But for the first time in his life, he found that his father's authority meant less to him than his wife's honor. No, Alexander said quietly. The single word fell into the silence like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock through everyone present. No one had ever refused a direct royal command from King William, especially not his own son. What did you say? The king asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I said no, father. I will not return to my quarters like a scolded child, and will not issue any statement that admits fault where none exists. Alexander moved to stand directly in front of his father's desk, his hands flat on its surface as he leaned forward. I have spent my entire life preparing to serve this crown and this country. I have sacrificed personal desires, private dreams, and individual freedoms for the sake of duty. But I will not sacrifice my wife's honor for the sake of political expediency. The room erupted again, with Prime Minister frantically discussing constitutional procedures, Edmund shouting about family loyalty, and various aides whispering urgently into their phones. But King William and Alexander remained locked in a stare that seemed to contain the weight of centuries of royal tradition. If you defy me on this, the king said slowly, there will be consequences. The throne requires absolute loyalty and absolute trust. If you cannot provide both, then perhaps you need to reconsider whether you are fit to inherit it. The threat hung in the air like a sword. For a moment, Alexander felt the full magnitude of what his father was suggesting. To lose his position as heir would mean losing everything he had been raised to be, everything he had prepared for his entire life. It would mean watching Edmund inherit the throne, ensuring that the monarchy would never change, never progress, never become the force for good that Alexander had dreamed it could be. But as he looked at, saw the tears she was fighting to hold back and the dignity with which she bore these false accusations, Alexander realized that some things mattered more than crowns and titles. "Then maybe you need to find a new heir," Alexander said, his voice steady despite the enormity of what he was saying. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the sounds of activity from the rest of the palace seemed to fade away, as if the entire building was holding its breath. King William's face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, anger, and finally something that might have been grief. "Alexander," whispered, her hand finding his arm, "you don't have to." "Yes, I do," he said, turning to face her with a small smile that held both sadness and determination. "I do have to. Because if I don't stand up for you now, if I don't prove that some things matter more than political games and ancient traditions, then I don't deserve to be king anyway." Edmund stepped forward, his face pale with shock. "Alexander, you can't be serious. You're talking about abandoning the throne, abandoning your duty to the country, abandoning everything our family has built." "I'm talking about building something better," Alexander replied, not taking his eyes off. "I'm talking about showing the world that love and honor and truth matter more than power and tradition and fear." Prime Minister was practically hyperventilating now. "Your Highness, please, think about what you're saying. If the heir to the throne renounces his inheritance over a scandal involving his wife, it will create a constitutional crisis unlike anything in our history." Alexander finally turned away from to address the room again, and when he spoke, his voice carried authority that came not from his royal title, but from his absolute certainty in his decision. "Then let there be a crisis. Let Parliament and the people and the press see what happens when good people are attacked by liars and cowards. Let them decide whether they want a monarchy that protects its own honor or one that sacrifices innocent people for political convenience." King William stood slowly, his age and the weight of the moment making him seem older than his 73 years. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion he was struggling to control. "Alexander, you are my son and my heir. I have spent 30 years preparing you for the responsibilities you would inherit. Are you really willing to throw all of that away for the sake of pride?" "Not for pride, father," Alexander replied gently. "For principle, for the belief that the monarchy should be a force for good in the world, not just a symbol of tradition and power. Has shown me what that looks like, and I won't abandon her for it." The king looked at his eldest son for a long moment, and in his eyes, Alexander could see the war between royal duty and paternal love, between the requirements of the crown and the desires of the heart. Finally, King William spoke, his voice formal and cold. "Very well. If that is your decision, then I will convene the Privy Council tomorrow morning to discuss the implications of your renunciation. Prince Edmund will be prepared to assume the duties of heir apparent." As the reality of what had just happened settled over the room, Alexander felt simultaneously devastated and liberated. He had just given up everything he had been raised to be, but in doing so, he had discovered who he actually was. And as took his hand and squeezed it tightly, he knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The news of Prince Alexander's confrontation with the king spread through the palace like wildfire, despite desperate attempts to contain it. By evening, every servant, guard, and courtier knew that the heir to the throne had his father and threatened to renounce his inheritance to defend his wife. The story leaked to the press within hours, creating exactly the constitutional crisis that everyone had feared. Alexander and sat in their private apartments, surrounded by the chaos of packing. They had decided that regardless of what the Privy Council decided the next morning, they could no longer remain in the palace. The weight of stares, whispers, and barely concealed hostility from the court had become unbearable for both of them. "Do you regret it?" asked quietly as she folded her clothes into a suitcase. Her voice carried exhaustion from the emotional turmoil of the day, but also something else, a note of wonder at what her husband had sacrificed for her sake. Alexander looked up from the documents he was organizing, legal papers that would formalize his renunciation if the situation couldn't be resolved. "Regret defending you? Never. Regret the way it had to happen, every moment." He moved to sit beside her on their bed, taking her hands in his. "I need you to understand something. I didn't do this just for you. I did it for us, for the kind of monarchy I believed we could build together. But now that's gone, she said, tears finally spilling over. All your dreams for changing things, for making the royal family more connected to the people, for using your position to help others, it's all gone because of me. No, Alexander said firmly, lifting her chin so she would look at him. It's gone because small-minded people couldn't see past their own fear and prejudice. It's gone because my own brother valued tradition more than truth. But what we built together, what we learned about service and compassion and standing up for what's right, that's not gone. That goes with us wherever we end up. A soft knock at the door interrupted them. Alexander called for whoever it was to enter, expecting Sir Thomas or perhaps one of their personal staff. Instead, King William stepped into the room alone, looking older and more tired than either of them had ever seen him. "Father," Alexander said, standing quickly, "I didn't expect." "Sit down, both of you," the king said wearily. "We need to talk, and I don't have much time before the courtiers and politicians start demanding answers I'm not ready to give." Started to stand, presumably to give father and son privacy, but King William gestured for her to remain seated. "This concerns you as much as anyone, perhaps more." The king pulled up a chair and sat facing them, his formal posture abandoned for something more human, more vulnerable. "Alexander, I have been king for 47 years. I inherited the throne when I was 26 years old, and I have spent every day since then trying to balance the impossible demands of tradition, politics, public expectations, and personal conscience." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts before continuing. "There have been times when I made decisions that protected the institution at the expense of individuals. Times when I chose stability over justice, appearance over truth. I told myself it was necessary, that the greater good required these sacrifices." Alexander and exchanged glances, uncertain where this was leading. "But today," King William continued, "watching my son willing to sacrifice everything for the sake of honor and truth, I realized something that should have been obvious years ago. An institution that cannot protect good people from evil lies is not worth protecting." The words hung in the air, and Alexander felt his heart begin to race. "Father, what are you saying?" King William stood and walked to the window, looking out at the palace grounds where protesters had gathered throughout the day. "I'm saying that you were right, not just about defending, but about everything. The monarchy has become so focused on preserving itself that it has forgotten why it exists in the first place." He turned back to face them, and for the first time since the crisis began, there was steel in his voice again. "Tomorrow morning, when I meet with the Privy Council, I will not be accepting your renunciation. Instead, I will be announcing a full and transparent investigation into the sources of the false allegations against. I will be demanding the immediate resignation of Lord Chancellor for his role in this conspiracy." Gasped, and Alexander felt his knees go weak with relief and disbelief. "And Edmund?" he asked quietly. The king's expression darkened. "Your brother will be stripped of all royal duties pending his own investigation. If it can be proven that he deliberately leaked false information to damage his reputation, he will face the full consequences of his actions, including possible criminal charges for conspiracy and treason." "Your Majesty," said, her voice shaking with emotion, "I don't know what to say after everything that's happened." "You don't need to say anything," King William interrupted gently. "You have served this kingdom with more honor and dedication than many people who have worn crowns. The accusations against you are not just false, they're obscene, and it's time the world knew that." Alexander felt tears he hadn't realized he was holding back finally fall. "Father, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the way I spoke to you, for defying you in front of others." "Don't apologize for standing up for what's right," the king said firmly. "Apologize for taking so long to teach me the same lesson. Alexander, you showed me today what kind of king you will be. Not one who preserves power at any cost, but one who uses power to protect those who cannot protect themselves." The relief was overwhelming, but Alexander forced himself to think practically. "What about Parliament?" The Prime Minister seemed convinced that this would bring down the government. King William smiled for the first time since the crisis began, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Let me worry about Parliament and the Prime Minister. When the full evidence of this conspiracy comes to light, when the public learns that their beloved princess was attacked by her own family members for the crime of helping refugees, I think you'll find that the political winds will shift dramatically." Over the next several hours, the palace transformed into a center of furious activity. Sir Thomas and his security team worked with investigators to trace every communication, every meeting, every conversation that had led to the false allegations against. What they found was even more damaging than Alexander had imagined. Not only had Edmund been feeding information to sympathetic journalists, but Lord Chancellor had been coordinating with opposition politicians to time their attacks for maximum political impact. They had planned to use the scandal to force changes in the government's refugee policy, essentially using her reputation as a weapon against the humanitarian programs she supported. Most shocking of all was the discovery that certain members of Parliament had been in communication with foreign interests who opposed the kingdom's assistance to refugees. The conspiracy wasn't just personal or political. It had international implications that bordered on treasonous. When the evidence was presented to Prime Minister the next morning, his reaction was swift and decisive. Rather than defend the conspirators, he immediately called for a special prosecutor to investigate the entire affair. The opposition politicians who had been demanding his head suddenly found themselves facing their own investigations. The public reaction was explosive. When the full scope of the conspiracy was revealed, when people learned that Princess had been attacked for trying to save lives while her attackers had been motivated by political ambition and possibly foreign influence, the tide of public opinion shifted completely. Demonstrations outside the palace changed from protests against to rallies supporting her. The hashtag #ProtectOurPrincess trended globally, and editorial writers who had condemned her humanitarian work just days before now praised her courage in the face of such vicious attacks. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when Ambassador himself requested a meeting with King William to formally testify about his conversations with. In front of television cameras and international media, the representative confirmed that every discussion with the princess had been focused solely on humanitarian aid and refugee assistance. "Princess saved thousands of lives," he stated clearly. "Her only crime was caring more about human suffering than political protocol. My government considers her a hero, and we are appalled that anyone would question her motives or her loyalty." As the truth emerged and the conspirators faced justice, Alexander and found themselves not just vindicated, but elevated in the public's estimation. Their willingness to sacrifice everything for the sake of truth and justice had captured the imagination of people around the world. 6 months later, as Alexander stood on the palace balcony at his side, waving to the crowds gathered below for the annual royal birthday celebration, he reflected on how much had changed. Edmund was in exile, his titles stripped and his political career destroyed. Lord Chancellor was in prison, convicted of conspiracy and treason. The monarchy itself had been transformed, becoming more transparent, more accountable, and more directly involved in addressing social problems. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had backed down?" asked quietly as they smiled and waved at their subjects. Alexander squeezed her hand and looked out at the sea of faces, many holding signs expressing their love and support for both of them. "I think," he said, "we would have saved the monarchy but lost our souls, and I think the kingdom would have been for it." As they walked back into the palace, past portraits of Alexander's ancestors who had ruled before him, he felt the weight of his future crown not as a burden but as an opportunity. The institution he would inherit had been tested and transformed, proven worthy not through its ability to preserve power, but through its willingness to serve justice. And as slipped her arm through his, Alexander knew that when his time came to rule, he would do so not just as a king, but as a man who had learned that the greatest strength lay not in demanding loyalty, but in being worthy of it.